A US-China war would not begin with a sudden surprise attack out of nowhere. Every serious military study, war game, and strategic assessment points to something far more gradual, far more tense, and also far more dangerous. A long escalation curve where diplomatic pressure, maritime confrontations, overlapping military deployments finally cross a line. In this video, I'm going to walk through one realistic pathway, not the only one, of course, but a plausible, well-supported scenario built from real doctrine, publicly available defense reports, and the patterns we're already seeing in the news in the Indo-Pacific today. So even before day one of a crisis, the environment around Taiwan and the South China Sea is already exceptionally crowded. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, conducts near daily air and naval pressure on Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Chinese Coast Guard and militia ships aggressively challenge Filipino vessels in the South China Sea, right? We've seen this. They use water cannons. There have been rammings, dangerous intercepts. Japan is deploying long-range missiles to its southwestern islands and increasing patrols around the East China Sea. And the United States is rotating more forces through Japan and the Philippines, including anti-ship missile units near the Bashi Channel. So none of this is hypothetical. It's all happening right now, and it forms the backdrop for any realistic US-China conflict scenario. So let's imagine the crisis that finally pushes things into a new phase. It starts not with a war, but with political friction in Taiwan. Maybe it's a new arms package, a visit from a high-ranking US official, a Taiwanese political decision that Beijing interprets as more creeping independence. China responds by announcing what it calls maritime inspections of ships heading to Taiwan. It declares temporary no-go zones in multiple quadrants around the island. And it launches large-scale joint exercises that surround Taiwan from almost every direction. We saw a rehearsal for this after Nancy Pelosi's visit in 2022. And Beijing's official military documents reference joint blockade operations as a core option. China insists this is not an attack, but it frames the move as legal, maybe a limited measure aimed at separatist forces, quote unquote, in Taiwan. But at the same time, cyber disruptions begin to affect Taiwanese networks and airport systems. There are likely to be space domain disturbances, GPS interference, or degraded satellite capability or links that analysts have long warned would accompany a blockade attempt. In other words, China escalates below the threshold of open conflict while claiming it's acting with restraint. We've reported on these gray zone tactics in earlier videos. But now the US and Japan are going to face a dilemma. If they do nothing, Taiwan begins to suffocate economically and psychologically under a de facto blockade. If they act too aggressively, they risk igniting the very war they're trying to prevent. But Washington and Tokyo are unlikely to stand by quietly. Instead, they may announce that they will escort shipping convoys into Taiwan under international law. US destroyers, cruisers, submarines move into the Philippine Sea and the East China Sea. Japan increases surveillance flights and brings its new long-range missiles into higher states of readiness. The Philippines grants expanded access for US patrol aircraft and missile units positioned in northern Luzon. And maybe we see the same in Australia. This moment, when all sides crowd into the same narrow operational space, is the most dangerous phase of this entire theoretical crisis. Multiple war games and defense studies emphasize that miscalculation, not deliberate aggression, is often the major trigger for conflict. Here, everyone's armed. Everyone is tense. Everyone believes they're acting defensively, and no one really wants to fire the first shot. Imagine the scene. Chinese warships begin shadowing a US convoy east of Taiwan. Fighters, bombers fly overhead. Japanese patrol aircraft orbit nearby. The water space is dense with submarines from multiple nations. Communications are strained. Political leaders on all sides are issuing statements. Domestic audiences are watching. 24-hour news cycle. Or just it keeps going, right? The margin for error starts to narrow. And again, like this is a hypothesis. This is speculation informed by study and reporting and etc. Then comes an incident. Probably something small at first, but catastrophic in its consequences. It could be a collision between a Chinese frigate and a U.S. destroyer, each one maneuvering to assert dominance, to assert presence, to just not give way. It could be a warning shot that ricochets into the hull of a ship. It could happen in the South China Sea, where China's Coast Guard already uses water cannons and high-risk maneuvers against Philippine vessels. A U.S. aircraft operating under a mutual defense agreement with the Philippines could be hit by debris or shrapnel during a confrontation between China and Manila. Or maybe a Chinese fighter jet could misjudge a close intercept of a U.S. aircraft, maybe a Poseidon, something like that. It causes a collision. But now this is far more volatile of a strategic moment. Whatever the spark is, the results are going to be immediate. There are casualties. Both sides go to their highest alert levels. Communications between Beijing and Washington become frantic. And China's leadership, now unsure whether the United States is preparing retaliation, faces a decision window, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but not days. Serious war games, including those by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, consistently show that the PLA would consider preemptive strikes against U.S. bases and naval forces if it believes a larger conflict is unavoidable. The logic's pretty grim. The side that seizes the initiative may avoid catastrophic early losses, but taking that initiative is itself an escalation into a full-scale war. So how does that look? China launches missile strikes at airfields in Japan housing U.S. aircraft. U.S. stealth bombers start long missions, and along with submarines, they both begin targeting PLA airfields, missile launchers, naval ships threatening the Taiwan Strait. Japan, whose bases in this scenario have been struck, activates its new counterstrike capabilities. Taiwan fights for air and maritime survival under intense pressure. So a crisis that began as a blockade has transformed into a regional war within hours. It is important to emphasize something the war games make very clear. Nobody wins quickly. It's not clean, and it's not decisive. Losses on all sides would be enormous. China's amphibious assault forces, if they ever attempted a landing on Taiwan, would suffer staggering casualties. U.S. and Japanese ships and aircraft would face significant attrition. Taiwan would endure missile strikes and infrastructure damage in every area. The global economy would take a blow larger than the 2008 financial crisis. And I think it would be significantly larger. And all of it would begin not because anyone wanted a war, but because a crowded, tense, high-stakes environment finally produced a mistake that no side could walk back. This scenario is not a prediction, right? It's a one, and I think realistic pathway built from known capabilities, strategic documents, and war games that model the opening hours of a conflict that no one wants. The most sobering conclusion from those studies is that the best way to prevent this war is to understand how easily it could begin. Deterrence, crisis communication, and restraint are not abstract concepts. They are the thin line here, preventing a crisis from tipping into catastrophe.